Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for Virginia Hanusik's talk, part of a series of online artist engagements that complements the exhibition Actions for Water that I've curated for the Tin Sheds Gallery. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation where the exhibition takes place and give thanks for their sovereign custodianship of lands and waters over millennia. Thank you to the School of Architecture, Design and Planning for hosting these talks, and particularly Jason Oakey's support, which unfolds the exhibition into the public domain online and extends the gallery as a space for critical conversations around architecture, art, design, and urbanism. As a platform for inquiry and imagination, connecting creative practice with global discourse, it's a pleasure to welcome an artist who is currently in the US, Virginia Hanusik, to be with us today. Virginia's projects explore the relationship between landscape culture and the built environment. Her book, Into the Quiet and the Light, Water Life and Land Loss in South Louisiana, was published by Columbia University Press in 2024 and has been shortlisted for the Paris Photo-Aperture First Photobook Award. This elegant and poetic publication is part of the Actions for Water Library, and I'm grateful to have a chance to deepen an understanding of Virginia's practice this morning into an expanded conversation about her work in the South Louisiana, situated where the Mississippi River meets the Gulf of Mexico and where water and the history of controlling it is omnipresent. We will have time for questions at the end of this presentation, so please pop them into the chat if you'd like to. But for now, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Virginia, and I'll hand over to her for her talk.
Thank you so much, Sharmila, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for having me here today. Today for you, tonight for me. I'm on East Coast time in New York right now. I am going to start with just a brief passage from my latest book project. So as previously mentioned, I've been working in Louisiana for about the past 11 years at this point. A lot of my photography work has to deal with climate change, extraction, and the spiritual and spatial qualities of moving through the world at a time of massive environmental degradation. I wanted to kind of start this talk with just a brief passage from my book project that Shamila had mentioned, Into the Quiet and the Light, that really discusses kind of the historical context that my work is in conversation with, and the present issues that I'm exploring. So I'll be sharing some other excerpts of the book throughout the conversation tonight, and I do encourage you to read all of them if you get a chance at some point. They're all really wonderful essays that I'll get into a little bit more detail in a bit. In 1948, a film about a young Cajun boy and his pet raccoon navigating an idyllic existence, mostly by boat, was made and set in the bayous of South Louisiana. The plot revolves around the boy's family, who allows an oil company to drill in the inlet that runs behind their home. As the story progresses, the company completes its operation and the friendly drillers depart, leaving behind an untouched, pristine environment and a newly wealthy family. Louisiana Story was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Writing in a Motion Picture Story in 1948, and in 1994 it was added to the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The film portrays the petrochemical industry in symbiotic harmony with people and the environment, ultimately implying that oil's machinery is a benign force, a message with a pernicious agenda, considering that the film was funded by the Standard Oil Company to promote its drilling ventures in Louisiana's waterways. It's one of many works reminding us that landscape representation is not neutral. It is both an inherently subjective and effective medium, connecting with and influencing our relationships, associations, and attitudes toward particular places. As in the film, cameras are often employed to construct a broader narrative beyond the frame, portraying land as a part of the human story. To talk about land and how we view it is to talk about how we view ourselves and each other. In Louisiana, the exploitation of land, its resources, and its people is connected to larger legacies of how we see space and how that act of looking has long been leveraged as a propagandistic tool. This book brings together a collection of my photographs that showcase the architecture and infrastructure of South Louisiana. It's uninterested in offering a superior way of seeing, but rather seeks to visualize and illustrate our relationships with coastal landscapes and the liminal spaces between land and water. These images are presented in tandem with written narratives that together unfold the spatial and spiritual qualities of moving through the world at a time of ecological collapse. With my work, I'm interested in parsing the complexity of living with a changing climate while advocating for the value of a place that is often seen by the rest of the country as a sacrificial climate buffer zone. The environmental parameters we're forced to reckon with today emphasize how living along the water will look increasingly different in the coming decades, especially as invisible infrastructures like flood insurance continue to alter the landscape. By focusing on the architecture, landscape, and infrastructure of South Louisiana, my images illuminate how we've altered the land through short-sighted technical measures and have thus chosen to protect certain communities over others. Massive feats of human engineering, such as the multi-billion-dollar lake-borne storm surge barrier, nicknamed the Great Wall of Louisiana, are pictured alongside more patchwork, individualized approaches to climate change adaptation in communities outside of the levee protection system. My pictures challenge the concept of resilience, as it has been used to describe communities who are left to pick up the pieces from a system that has often failed to protect them. I've approached photographing these structures as a way to understand and analyze human nature, how ideas around ownership, community, and identity are manifested across the built environment. The idea and practice of controlling water has been and continues to be a critical part of Louisiana's modern history. Who has controlled it and what purpose it serves reflects greater ideas about the perceived value of property and of people. As stronger hurricanes, rising sea levels, and the fossil fuel industry threaten the existence of the coast as we know it, how will our physical, mental, and emotional connections to these landscapes be maintained? Can the architecture of these places promote ways of living and building that are more attuned to the nurturing of coastal ecosystems, both environmentally and culturally? And as we emerge into the environmental unknown, how might we visualize, narrate, and imagine different stories for South Louisiana? Okay. So with that, I will start at the beginning, or the way that I think of the beginning in terms of framing a lot of my work and my projects. And that's looking at the history of American landscape painting, landscape representation in America, and why Louisiana has oftentimes been left out of that canon. The practice of visually representing land has been critical to the construction and endurance of American identity and United States nation building. Beginning with the Hudson River painters of the early 19th century, landscape artists such as Thomas Cole, pictured here, helped define what was beautiful and God-given to Americans. And as the newly colonized continent was being cultivated, the discretionary power of beauty emerged alongside these forms of representation. And we see the origins of which landscapes are worthy of being celebrated and what makes an iconic American scene. So theories kind of stemming from the European Romantic painters around the picturesque helped establish this hierarchy of scenery in American landscapes that prioritized more mountainous terrain over flatter landscapes, valuing the composition of light and shadow that topography with a range and elevation provided. So wetlands, as pictured here, painted by Joseph Rustling Meeker in 1871, these wetlands really challenged and confused the dominant conceptions of what was considered a proper landscape, to the point where it was questioned if Louisiana could even be referred to as land, much less painted as a landscape. Artists really didn't know what to do with this land for the most part, but there were a few, like pictured here, from the Bayou School of Art, whose work really depicts the ethereal quality of the swamps. It actually wasn't until 2019, at an exhibition at the New Orleans Museum of Art, where Louisiana landscape painting was placed in a wider national and international context with the exhibition Inventing Acadia. And one of the reasons for this lack of visual representation is due in part to this much broader history of describing and devaluing land deemed unfit for a specific use. And one of the scholars whose work I relied on a lot while making this book project was Vittoria De Palma, who teaches at UCLA. She's the author of a book called Wasteland. And in her book, she describes geographies that have come to be characterized as the anti-picturesque, like swamps, which have traditionally drawn fear and contempt. She refers to one of the most popular books ever printed, The Pilgrim's Progress, with the map pictured here, where the main character traverses the allegorical landscape to seek salvation. And in this work of theological fiction, the swamp is presented as a landscape at its most contaminated and polluted, where the scum and filth that attends conviction for sin doth continually run, as quoted. And these ideas and emotions connected to the swamp are clearly present in the history and development of Louisiana. Despite the state's wetlands not receiving recognition at the scale of American national parks, it remains one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world. Its lack of representation in the American art canon has not precluded it as a site of interest and management by the US. Rather, it's become a site of extreme opportunity, extraction, and exploitation. So in this map, these are one of the famous Fisk maps made in the 1940s, showing the many pathways that the Mississippi River has taken over thousands of years. And South Louisiana was formed by the Mississippi River by centuries of sediment carried down through its delta some 7,000 years ago. The river is naturally meant to be in a constant ebb and flow, as pictured here, but began to be locked in place as development in the river's floodplain grew. The river's unruliness prompted this further cause for federal intervention after the 1927 flood, the most destructive river flood in United States history that left 23,000 square miles of land submerged and over 200 people dead. This is just a map right here of the Army Corps of Engineers, kind of the map of levees and other infrastructure that's meant to lock the river in place. And of course, one of the leading architects of kind of the design and manipulation of the river is James Eads. And the very last part that you can get to at the mouth of the Bird's Foot Delta is a part of Louisiana called Port Eads. There's a lighthouse that's still present there. So in 1927, with this flood, it spawned the Flood Control Acts of 1928 and 1936, which were authorized by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to construct thousands of miles of levees, dikes, and dams that altered the flow of water, sediment, and its ability to regenerate land in Louisiana. Just to go back to this slide, actually, I put this in here, and it's also a photograph that's in the book as a historical kind of photograph that it demonstrates this history of violence and manipulation of the landscape, and kind of ties into a lot of these ideas that we'll talk a bit later on about sacrificing certain communities for the benefits of others, and how controlling water ultimately has very political and social impacts. So the picture here during the 1927 flood, Plaquemines and St. Bernard parishes, which are located downriver from New Orleans, were sacrificed in order to relieve pressure from the levees further upriver. In a decision that was heavily influenced by bankers and other business leaders of New Orleans, the governor called for the levees to be dynamited. The parishes were flooded, perpetuating the concept of a buffer zone where the displacement of people, their homes, and their communities was accepted for the sake of upholding infrastructure. A practice that has led to intense distrust of the management and purpose of these infrastructures to this day. And I, of course, want to mention the role of oil and gas as it relates to visual propaganda and the ways that the fossil fuel industry completely reshaped the physical landscape of Louisiana. Companies dredged canals to transport crude, allowing salt water to intrude deep into the marsh and kill the flora and fauna that once thrived there. And in Louisiana's story, scenes of drillers working beside Cajun families perpetuated this myth that there are no consequences of fossil fuel extraction. And in reality, it's been one of the main drivers of the state's land loss crisis, as pictured here, a map of Lower Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes and Jefferson Parish is in there as well, actually demonstrating the amount of land that has been lost between 1932 to 2011. Yeah. And so this is significantly increased with this picture over the past decade or so. And in the book, I really wanted to present how, with the film, with its award-winning artistry, along with other visual material like postcards, billboards, ultimately contributed to Big Oil's successful reach in the region, which is still very present. If anyone has been to the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, it's been sponsored for decades by Shell. We have a really crazy festival called the Louisiana Shrimp and Petroleum Festival. They make the craziest kind of posters every year. So it's just kind of this, these are examples of kind of the insidious nature of the oil and gas industry kind of weaving its way into art and culture in the state. So that was a lot, but just to kind of transition into the actual content of the book itself as it comes to the written material and my own photographs. I think that what makes this book so special is the collection of essays from contributors who have helped me see and understand this landscape in a way that a still frame can never capture. The folks that are listed here are just a small sample of the many individuals who have influenced this body of work. And I'm so very grateful that they allowed their words to be seen alongside my photographs, to trust me with that. They range from climate activists to architects to chefs to shrimpers to musicians, and their stories reach across time, various sites, forms, and genres to share multiple yet interconnected histories and reflections on the present. As I was working on this body, this project and how I wanted to ultimately gather the material for it, the photographs I had been making for about 9 or so years at that point, and it was very important to me to be able to incorporate a lot of the voices and people who have shaped, like I said, the way that I see this landscape and have learned about it and have grown to love it. So I'll just mention a couple folks individually as we go on here, but one of the questions that I get asked most is, why are there no people in my photographs? How can I speak to the history and culture of a place without people populating the frame? And I, like many people, I'm sure, who are either on this call or work in architecture, believe that the built form holds collective memory and has a power to describe how we view the land and each other. And over the years, I've found that these structures communicate the juxtaposition of monumentality and permanence in a shifting landscape. I believe the architecture and infrastructure are the actual manifestation of beliefs and values in physical form. They also assist in communicating how disasters are created. with the pretense that they do not happen in a vacuum. And that was another idea that I was exploring with this project and something that's really shaped my practice is thinking about how we understand and visualize climate change. What are the psychological impacts of disaster imagery and what are its limits in terms of impact and engagement with the viewer? There are a lot of dominant stock images around the climate crisis. But with this book, I wanted to explore other ways of looking at the causes rather than the symptoms of the world that we live in. Um, I think for this, just to pause on this photograph, it's an image of a house in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans, directly next to the industrial canal levee wall that breached during Hurricane Katrina. Um, and I think a lot of the photographs that I'm drawn to make, and especially that have been collected in this book, are about scale and distance, particularly as they relate to perception, the distance between buildings, the distance between the house and the ground, between a house and a flood wall, communicate our relationship with the earth. And I really intentionally seek out this direct and indirect evidence of these designed interventions to capture not just how we've normalized unnatural changes in habitat, but to speculate on what that ultimately means for our shared future. This is a triptych of the lake-borne storm surge barrier, which is nicknamed the Great Wall of Louisiana. Um, it was built after Hurricane Katrina by the US Army Corps of Engineers to attempt to hold back the surge from a 1 in 100 year storm. It's the largest design build project in the history of the Army Corps. And the distrust of this agency and who they serve obviously has a long history that predates Katrina. But the visual decision to break up the representation of this massive structure ultimately kind of comes down to thinking about fracturing and how life in Louisiana is so fractured along economic, along political, social lines. Um, so I'm also interested in, again, this idea of perception by embracing the fact that no two people see or react to things in the same way. So this book is really an experiment with layering experiences to challenge the limits of representation in visual material. Um, Photography is a medium, this is not my photograph. Photography is a medium that has historically been used to communicate truth or an objective survey of the land, like with the work of Carlton Watkins pictured here in the West. The reality is, of course, that this work is subjective and was ultimately used as marketing material for westward expansion in America. So there's a bit more, in the book talking kind of about this legacy and the photographer as this artist, documentarian, and the objectivity of the photograph and the fallacy in that. The work that I am drawn to make and talking about this landscape in particular is intentionally messy, and I'm biased, but I think that all of the essays that myself and my editors at Columbia worked to cultivate are incredible. And one of my favorites is from Billy Fleming, who teaches landscape architecture at Temple University. He used this image as his prompt and wrote from the perspective of this wellhead. So this is an abandoned oil well in Plaquemines Parish, once on land, now completely submerged by water. He researched the lease that it was under after I gave him the coordinates of where this was taken in Plaquemines. And in the piece, he talks about how the deposition and accumulation of biotic material has been hurtling towards this location for at least 5.3 million years. It's an amazing piece, and It's something that talking about the role of oil and gas, and again, kind of thinking about the more causal aspects rather than focusing on disaster imagery, or so oftentimes we see these pictures of flooding and the after effects of hurricanes in South Louisiana. I really wanted to attempt to provide this more holistic picture of a place and all of the oftentimes conflicting narratives that are present there. Another example is this image that was chosen by Nini Nguyen, who is a fantastic Vietnamese chef from New Orleans East. She's been on Top Chef. She's incredible. She chose this picture of the shrimp nets in Plaquemines Parish for her writing about her family's history in the seafood industry as Vietnamese immigrants. And she wrote a recipe for chow tom, which is ground shrimp wrapped with sugarcane and grilled. I've made it. It's really, really good. And I just think that having this kind of collection, or what I hope anyone who has a chance to read the book or just think about these stories in conversation with each other, are these multiple truths that ultimately exist at once in this landscape, and to really challenge the idea of these disaster oriented narratives that are often put here. So some just other aesthetic choices, like the decision to have the images presented in black and white rather than in color, were influenced by a few things. One of them is that the pictures are presented here are mostly structural. Again, my background being in architecture, I'm very partial to showing the work in a way that really valued the basics of light and shadow to describe the architecture and the infrastructure itself, and the ways that you have these multiple forms interacting with each other, patterns that begin to emerge. So it was also kind of in conversation with this legacy of hyper aestheticized disaster imagery that's present, and thinking about the ways that um, using color and saturation ultimately adds to this kind of entertainment effect of these images of disaster. I'm also, this is not my photograph again, but I'm also greatly inspired by the work of Robert Adams. He's probably the most influential photographer in my career, whose work chronicles the devastation of forests in the American West. And around the time that I started putting together the bones of what this book was going to look like a few years ago, his retrospective called American Silence came out at the National Gallery of Art. And I believe that the New York Times, in a review, called his show a sunlit apocalypse. So it's a spiritual experience to look at his work, and I've always gravitated to his ability to show the light and the darkness simultaneously. A quote from the description of his show Gone, Colorado in the 1980s, which was shown at the Frankel Gallery in California in San Francisco in 2010, is where the title of this book came from. And it says, in middle age, I revisited a number of marginal but beautiful landscapes that I had taken for granted when I was a boy. As I walked through them, I sometimes asked myself whether in the coming years they would survive overpopulation, corporate capitalism, and new technology. On those days when I was lucky, however, my questions fell away into the quiet and the light. And just to show a couple more images from the book, um, there really is no singular way of reading this body of work. And that's something that was really important to me as we were kind of, again, gathering the material for it. I wanted to just share a poem by Louis Michaud, who is the frontman for the Cajun band Lost Bayou Ramblers. He wrote this piece, and once I read it and we got the first draft, and my editors and I knew it was the perfect ending to the book. The poem is first written in French, and is translated in English, so I will read that version. And just for context, because I don't think that I mentioned this, but all of the contributors chose what image that they wanted to have their work paired with. So in the process of kind of putting this project together, there was an edit of about 30 to 40 photographs that I sent to everyone who was commissioned to write a piece for it, and they chose what image they wanted their work to go next to. So Louis, his poem Shortcuts was paired with this image. Help, help, we can't stay here, passing our time, waiting for someone else to think of our well-being and our happiness. Every day is a blessing, another day closer to heaven, if we believe that our life on earth isn't heaven itself. And when will we see that life isn't a race, that there's no saving us, that there's no paradise? Except here now, and when will we stop playing cards with what God gave us? When the decision is made to take care of our own well-being, as if the work is all done to improve our quality of life. There is no savior, no vessel for a land that was cut to make shortcuts. To make a quick dollar, hoping to live on vacation, we made a bet and we lost. Jesus Christ, forgive our sins and save us from our greed. No boat, no miracles. Let's get out the way and let the rivers fill our cups, rebuild our land here in paradise. And that's how the book ends. Um, and I'm happy to answer any questions or to just talk a bit more in depth on certain aspects of that presentation.
Thank you so much, Virginia. I think if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat. I definitely think that there are many parallels with the Australian context, particularly around the history that we have of devaluing lands and waters through, as someone pointed out in the chat, a kind of landscape chauvinism, and also resonances with the impact of fossil fuel and the uneven impacts of on communities along race and class lines. But I really appreciate the kind of sense of care that you demonstrate in your work. And thank you so much for such a thoughtful presentation as well. So a question that I have is around some of the kind of ways that you've brought in personal essays, microhistories, recipes, and even song lyrics in the book, Into the Quiet and the Light. I found this kind of polyphonic layering of very textural. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how that kind of collaboration emerged and how you've worked with all these different voices that you've included in the book.
Yeah. So I moved to New Orleans in 2014 to work for a nonprofit that was doing coastal restoration work. So I grew my practice kind of in parallel to that work that I was doing that was much more environmentally focused. Again, my background, I went to school undergrad for architecture and environmental studies. Um, so I started working with a lot of organizations that were immersed in and working kind of along the lines of coastal restoration, water management, not just in New Orleans, but throughout South Louisiana. So becoming more involved in the actual process of what was being done as a master plan and kind of organizing and whatnot on the ground for these big projects that had to do with restoring land, building new land, altering the course of the Mississippi River, and also thinking about this legacy of environmental injustice in Louisiana and South Louisiana specifically. There's a area of between Baton Rouge and New Orleans on the Mississippi River that's nicknamed Cancer Alley because of the the concentration of refineries and petrochemical plants there that obviously have extremely adverse health outcomes for the surrounding communities that live near there. So I just through this work became like very engaged and just extremely curious, also just being from a landscape that's so different from the Louisiana landscape. I grew up in upstate New York, in the Hudson River Valley. That is kind of why so much of my work kind of starts at this point of thinking about why we value certain places over others, and some ultimately get more protections. So through the work that I was doing in coastal restoration, meeting folks through that process and just becoming more involved politically in a lot of things that were happening in the state, just ultimately led me to these amazing relationships that I've fostered with a lot of folks. So almost all of the people included here I've worked with in some capacity, but there are a couple that I've just really admired their work for a very long time, and invited them to participate, and am just so grateful that they said yes.
You were mentioning before that some of that they chose the photographs that would sit next to their adjacent to their work. What was that type of process? How did you work through that with them?
It was pretty seamless. I mean, my editors and I kind of went through this a really kind of long process of how we wanted the text to be included and whether or not they were going to be captions or have the pictures as plates and then the text is separate. But what we ultimately fell on was kind of like this extended caption type situation where knowing the folks that I wanted to have involved, kind of giving them a select edit of not all the pictures that were going to be in the book, but I would say close to half of them. Um, just, kind of giving them an open prompt for what they wanted to contribute. And that was, I think, one of the really unique aspects of the book is that not all of the written contributions are the same. Like there are micro histories, there are personal essays, there are recipes, like all of these different formats that really represent this range of um, culture bearers and people who are doing a lot of the on the ground, like grassroots activism in the state too, as it comes to climate justice. So yeah, I mean, there were a couple of back and forth just with the editing that goes into a book project, but it was really beautiful, like just to see the contributions come in and for people to kind of like run with it in their own way.
It definitely brings such a beautiful, it really expands um, the kind of poetic nature of the book. We have a question from Nicole, which in the chat, she says, thanks, Virginia. That was very interesting and inspiring. She'd like to know if you can talk more about the disaster narratives that you referred to.
Yeah, I think so I'll just speak from the American context. Is I grew up in a landscape, like I said, outside of Louisiana, and thinking through so many of the kind of iconic pictures of Louisiana that we often see have to do with the effects of Hurricane Katrina. These really like disaster oriented, this visual narrative that has to do with destruction and flooding and trauma. Um, and I think what I've seen through my own experience and through that of others working in this landscape for over 10 years at this point is that there's a lot of helicopter journalism that comes in for people who want to kind of get this aestheticized story of the what the front lines of climate change looks like, and get a lot of images that have to do directly with the effects of a hurricane or a flood, kind of like these pictures that I say are disaster narratives, but don't necessarily talk about the why this happened or why certain communities are suffering more than others, or why 2 years later after a hurricane, people are still living in RVs and in trailers and haven't been able to rebuild their homes. And I think, talking about architecture itself, I'm biased, but I find it to be endlessly, there are just so many possibilities to talk about human nature and how we think about our relationships with each other and with the earth itself in terms of how we decide to build, where we decide to build. Um, one of the things that I just struck me visually right away when I moved to this landscape so long ago was driving down the coast and seeing this stark contrast between a house that is directly slab on grade, so on a concrete slab, and then you put the house right on top. There's no basements in Louisiana. Um, Next to a house that's raised 12 feet, next to a house that's raised 20 feet. So for me, thinking about the reasons as to why that exists and these like invisible kind of policies that ultimately dictate how and where people can build and who can rebuild is much more interesting than exclusively making a project or thinking through this visual lens of um, what a hurricane or storm has done to this landscape, if that makes sense.
I think that, this follow-up question also from Nicole probably engages with some of those ideas around how you represent architecture in the built environment, which is in relation to the photos of the houses on stilts. Are you critiquing or valorizing those homes?
I think, it's for me, it's like I said, this curiosity and just desire to question and use the built form as a way to peel back these layers and think about ultimately like the policies that have guided in the United States um the development of flood zones. So we have the National Flood Insurance Program is something that was built out in the 1950s or early 60s that ultimately was a program by the US federal government that encouraged and incentivized the development of flood zones in the US by backing homeowners insurance. And you have kind of a lot of the challenges of that playing out today in coastal environments where folks whose properties are being extremely, are the value of that property is decreasing rapidly, don't cannot sell their properties. I'm thinking specifically in South Louisiana, because of course the coast is not just one environment across the board. It has a lot to do with um, populations and demographics of the region, of course. But in Plaquemines Parish, which is the last parish between New Orleans and the end of the Mississippi River, where I work a lot, and a lot of the photographs in the book were taken. Um, there are many people that either can't sell their home or with buyouts that they have been offered by the government couldn't afford to buy something of equal size in another area. So you kind of have like thinking about architecture is not necessarily valorizing or um it's not a critique of whether these things are right or wrong, but as a platform to think critically about these larger issues that I think that manifest in the physical form. And I also think of the architecture of this region just as endlessly fascinating to me because Louisianans have for generations lived with water. And it's not something that has just popped up in, the past couple of years that I have been living and working there. There's these generational ties to land and thinking about living with water in a way that was at one point harmonious, now not so much, and kind of like this uh intensity to try to control our ability to live in the same place, also speaking about, like I said, kind of the generational ties to that land itself. So that was a lot. That was a long question. I don't know if I actually answered it in the way that you were hoping to, but I just, yeah, I really go off of like a lot of artists like William Christenberry and the Beschers, who use the built form as a way of like talking about our um social relationships, memory, and the ways that we're connected to space itself.
I think in your work, there's something really powerful about how you position architecture as a vessel of memory that really contains a lot of the is like a relic of the kind of structural violence and environmental impact that you're talking about in your work. Um, Jason is asking, do you feel that your work is a way of building up a landscape, literacy, or lexicon?
Hmm. I haven't been asked that question before. I talk a lot about whether this work is documentation of a place, or um, if it is something of a more like uh, speculative idea around what the future might bring by thinking about building structures and ways that we've built past and present. I think that, the most fruitful thing for me in my practice is building my own literacy in how I photograph and the structures that I choose to take pictures of. I'll say that, my practice as anyone it has changed over time, where I would say in the early stages of building this collection of work, it was much more exploratory rather than um rather than critical isn't necessarily the right word, but you over time and working with so many different people and learning so many things about just the way that water has controlled the physical controlling water has been so integral into Louisiana history. It's really shaped like my decisions to photograph certain structures over others, and um, photographing in certain communities, like thinking about what it's like to be inside the levee system versus outside the levee system. So I think also my um uh, I'm not really drawn to make work that is more like a quote unquote coffee table book, and that's no disrespect to anyone who desires to kind of have their work shown in just a very like straightforward book form of photographs. I think there's so many beautiful examples of that, but for the work that I make that requires so much context oftentimes, and wanting the audience or whoever comes into contact with it to have a deeper and kind of richer understanding of the artistic decisions that went behind the actual making of the photographs themselves. Um, I do see this book as a type of literacy or um, starting point for people who are more interested in these issues or didn't know about them before.
Can I just ask as well to follow up? Is there a type of mapping practice that you also are engaged with in this work? You've included maps. Do you see photography as a kind of type of cartographic process as well?
Hmm, that's interesting. I mean, in a way, do I make physical maps? No, but I photograph certain places over and over again over multiple years. And that's not something that's necessarily demonstrated in this book, but in my wider practice as a means of marking time, of marking place, of marking changes, um, that's not meant to be objective as a map would be. Like, there's, again, talking about the subjectivity of maps and what to include, and all of those inherent biases that go into the actual map making process. I think for me, photography and just art making in general has obviously so much subjectivity and like um personal aspects to it, in terms of what gets shown and what doesn't. And I have these uh, photographs of the same places over like decades that kind of provide like this mental map for me in some way, or just of talking about a place. But I don't necessarily see that as a tool for others, but more so for myself.
Is durational, like long-term durational projects important to you? Having, returning to places, that kind of sustained inquiry?
It is. I have a very complicated relationship with Louisiana, as many people who love that landscape. There's a lot of difficult things about living in Louisiana, but there's so much beauty that exists at the same time that I um I'm sorry, I just completely blank thinking about my complicated relationship with Louisiana. What was the question again?
I think it was just about the
Long
long,
term,
yeah.
yeah, long term commitment. Sorry, wow, I went off on a tangent. Yes, for me specifically, because I am not from Louisiana. I have, being a transplant and not being someone who has generational ties to this landscape itself, it's important to me, just out of blatant respect for the communities who I've worked with and people that I've worked with, the love that I have for this place, and the investment and care that I have, and can never see myself not engaging and working and being in that landscape. It has a very like special way of grabbing hold of you. So, but again, not all of my projects are multi-year investments. I think that it is dependent on the type of project, of course, that you're making. And I also see collaboration as like a really wonderful tool for thinking about, of course, the narratives that someone like myself can't tell, not just because of where I'm from, but I think also my medium that I work in, with visual art specifically, there's a limit to that. And yeah, I really want to continue to embrace the collaborative component with my work, and future projects that are underway right now. But the book has been like a really wonderful like practice and meaning making with all of the folks who contributed.
So Amani Jacqueline Brown is one of the contributors to the book, and she's also in the exhibition Actions for Water with What Remains at the Ends of the Earth. And she powerfully situates Louisiana's coastal wetlands with the long history of extraction. But she also talks really powerfully, and she writes about how enslaved people once planted magnolias and willow trees to mark graves, cultivating microecologies that continue to support resistance and remembrance. And so I wanted to ask you, do you see actions of repair that give you hope for the future?
I mean, I see it with people that I work with on a daily basis, with um one of my dear friends who wrote the second piece that's in the book. His name is Richie Blank. He is a um, former oil and gas worker, but now runs a eco tour company out of Plaquemines Parish, talking directly about the harm that the oil and gas industry has done to the coast, and showcasing ways that nonprofits and also government programs prior to the current administration were doing that were actual restorative projects for the coast itself. And it's a dark time for Louisiana with the administration that is currently in place, and also just for the United States as a whole, in terms of climate justice and any sort of work that would be done to mitigate the impacts of climate change and to move forward towards a more just future. So I see, if you want to call it hope or just a commitment and investment and love for a place in so many of the people, like I said, that I work with on a daily basis. And Richie's just an example of that, but also the folks who are actually doing like the climate advocacy work. Louisiana Bucket Brigade is a policy organization that works with frontline communities that are directly adjacent to a lot of these plants in Cancer Alley. And of course, Imani's work is just so incredible that, the work that she does, and a number of other artists that are from Louisiana talking about their experience and the ways that this landscape is specific, but also not specific, in terms of there are things that transcend place when it comes to extraction and exploitation that can be found around America and around the world.
Well, I think so much of your work is poignantly bringing a lot of these issues greater visibility. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing as well. Diana would like to know where we can, how we can get your books, and if there's any other books that you've made where they could be purchased.
This is my first and only book at the moment. I do believe that there are a number of stores, booksellers online that are still selling copies. We fortunately, but unfortunately, ran out of the first edition. So we're currently working on getting a second edition printed. So if you can't find it at Columbia University Press, their actual website, I think that there are a number of like other booksellers that are still selling it. But you can place a copy. It would just be on back order for a bit longer, unfortunately.
Diana, we could also share Virginia's website and Instagram handle as well, if that helps. We do have to close the talk today, so thank you everyone who's joined us this morning, and for really the continued work, important work that you're doing, Virginia. We do have two final talks online from Tomoko Hayashi tomorrow and Joel Deep on Thursday. The exhibition Actions for Water is on at Tin Sheds Gallery until the 25th of July. So please again join us in thanking Virginia for such a beautiful talk this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.